So right now I'd like to introduce a friend of mine who is a director here at Seattle Pacific University. She heads up our Center for Biblical and Theological Education. Her name is Celeste Cranston, and really this conference here is largely supported by the funding from Celeste's center that she directs. So I'd like to briefly kind of direct your attention to the front here. We're going to watch a real quick video on the Lectio.
My experience is that many of us, when we encounter biblical text, have a sense of almost paralysis about how do I really make sense of this? How can I call this Scripture mine? The Lectio is a free guided Bible reading program that is online that has been put together by our School of Theology faculty to build a bridge between the world of academia and the world of the church to enable deeper levels of biblical understanding. The purpose of the Lectio is to empower us to approach the text with the benefit of a guide, someone who is biblically trained, a scholar who can bring authority to the study, but also someone who has a deeply personal Christian faith.
One thing that we want to do in the guided reading is offer a blend of good academic scholarship, but have it be accessible enough that really just about any Christian or any interested person can hear or read and understand it and appreciate it. I often encounter students that tell me two things about the Bible. First, that they find it to be their authority and the foundation for their faith, but also that they find it very difficult to read and thus they don't invest a lot of time in reading it. What the guide offers is an opportunity to see a bigger picture, to get a little sense of method and context, so that they can engage in the relevance of Scripture and thus find it easier to read.
I would read something and then I wouldn't know where to go from there, and the Lectio really helped me know what to do next and how to use what I just read to play into my life. I definitely think it helped me understand more than I ever could have on my own, and the Lectio really allowed me to realize, I guess, the importance of reading more than just a verse or two, but actually looking at the Bible in context.
I think there's something healthy in recognizing the challenge of the complexity of Scripture, but at the same time I think the issue is relevance. A lot of people just don't find the Bible relevant to their everyday life. And one thing that we're trying to do in the guided reading is help make that connection so that people can engage in Scripture, appreciate it, and live by it in a way where they're inspired to read it more and more.
One of the great things about the Lectio is that it provides a wide range of ways that people can engage. You can listen to it online through the podcast, you can read it, you can download it, or essentially print it off and hand it to a friend.
The question of why this is the case is explored more closely in the Sermon of Parables. The Greek word parabole.
As a pastor, I struggle with how do I shape and help form a biblical imagination in our church, and how do you see the whole broad story, but also see the depth of it and see the richness of it, and that excitement that comes when you start noticing the details. And so the way we've decided to do that at Hillcrest is with Lectio. So one of the things that Lectio has helped us do is coordinate our whole community's focus on Scripture. And so kind of the vision for that would be that, in the car on the way home from church on Sunday, the parents could ask the kids, what did you study this morning in Sunday school? And then they could have a conversation about the passage where everybody is on the same footing as far as what they know.
It's a 4-year program that is built around, again, this concept of bringing the Bible to life, making it accessible for an everyday person to connect with biblical themes and biblical understandings. That's our heart's desire. Thank you so much for the opportunity just to share a little bit about what's been happening here on this campus in regard to some new efforts. As Billy said, I'm Celeste Cranston, the director of the Center for Biblical and Theological Education, and we are really pleased you're here. Really pleased to be able to be partnering with what's happening here in the Asian American Ministry Program to put this conference together. And also just to let you know about the Lectio. Right in the middle of your table is a piece of paper like this. If you can grab one, I'd love that. Essentially, this is just an opportunity for you, if you would like to find out more about the program we were just, the video was about, you can just take a minute and give us your name and email address and fill that out. Also, if you'd like to know more about the university's seminary graduate programs, you can click a box there for that as well. And then just leave this on the table. But essentially, the Lectio is, as the video explained, just an attempt to bring the complexity of Scripture together in such a way with the actual relevance as it talked about, so that it can become accessible to people. And it's a free resource. It's available because of the generosity of the Murdoch Grant and the commitment of this university to furthering biblical and theological education. So we like to say we're giving away biblical education, and we would love to have more people involved, more churches connected. You can sign up here, and then you'd be getting a weekly email that just tells you that you would be getting notice of the new reading that comes up every week. Or you can just check us out online, whatever you're more comfortable with. But I guess what we really want to say is that we'd love to be partnering with you in seeing how the Bible can come to life in our believers and in the lives of our churches. So if this is helpful, we just invite you to let us partner with you. Just fill it out, leave it on the table, or as I said, check it out online. But we think essentially what we're doing is bringing the very best of our biblical scholarship into an accessible online format for folks. And again, if this is useful to you, to your churches, please check it out. All right, and blessings on you for the conference. Again, we're so thankful you're here, thankful for this opportunity to see what God is going to do in and through these days together. So blessings.
Thanks very much, Celeste. Let's see here. Is Charlene here? Is she back yet? She had to step out for just a quick second to pick something up. Well, the theme really that we had kind of planned really this morning around was this idea of Christian formation for Asian Americans. I think the reality is that we all have different lived experiences, right? For us as Asian Americans, we have a particular experience. And what we saw last night and what we've been exploring even this morning is just the diversity of those lived experiences. I first came to meet Charlene Jin down at Fuller for an Isaac conference just earlier this year. And I was captivated really by her talk. Charlene speaks with such a charisma and such an artistry to her talk. She nudges you and she pokes at certain parts of things that you're feeling in ways that perhaps are a little bit less traditional. So I felt it was just so appropriate to bring her really to speak with us today. Charlene Jin, she is the assistant professor of education ministry at San Francisco Theological Seminary. And she also mentors lots of different students at the seminary. She's actually the director of student formation there. And when I kind of started to dig a little bit more into Charlene's research, I became a little bit more excited about the things that she's kind of studying. She has devoted a lot of her research specifically focused on curriculum, on education ministry, and how that intersects with essentially our lived experience. So I felt like, again, it was just a really appropriate, to bring her here this morning. Let's see here. Charlene. She's not here yet. Okay. Gosh, I'm going to think about other things to say here. Let's see here. Is she there, Mark?
No, she's not here yet, but can we ask a question back, to Peter Cha?
Sure, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Did you have a question, so long as it's not? Okay.
Peter, it's okay if I ask that question then?
Yep.
So my question is, the whole metaphor of the choir and singing the sectional parts and doing the sectional rehearsals well. So my question is, are we doing the sectional rehearsal well as Asian American Christians, as Asian American Christianity? What does good sectional rehearsal look like for Asian American Christianity? Because it seems to me that though we think we might be bassists or we are cast as bassists, we're really singing the soprano part. And the tenors and the altos are doing their parts well, and they can afford to go across. But as bassists, I don't know if we know we're bassists and what that looks like. And so what would that, we're singing the soprano part, it seems.
Yeah. No, that's a very good question. I thought I dodged that one, but here we are. When I look at particularly evangelical part of the Asian American church, because many of us had been trained in more conservative seminaries where one voice was very dominant, never heard the other voices. We have internalized much of that, and yesterday Tim Sang pointed out from Divided by Faith, the limitedness of the cultural toolkit. And when I first read that book, Divided by Faith, I thought, wait a minute, that's my cultural toolkit too. So there's a lot more work that needs to be done on the evangelical seminaries and evangelical congregations, because often we have overly utilized resources from evangelical publishers, which up until recently, I'm thinking about InterVarsity Press and so forth, are doing a great job, start bringing other voices. But until recently, a lot of the Sunday school curriculum and so forth was very much shaped by one voice, right? Which is fine. So we get to hear that voice, but then that should prompt us to now to look deeply into developing our own voice. Now, my theology says that our God is not only sovereign, but he's very providentially involved in all of our lives. So in some ways, way to think about what is our own voice is to see what God's doing in our midst and how God has brought together, let's say, these immigrant families and formed these immigrant churches, and we have a particular struggles as well as particular gifts. How do we look at that as a providential grace of God? And then theologically reflecting on both our challenges as well as our opportunities to see what might be this unique voice we can raise. And that's why I'm excited about the groups like Isaac, because I think what they're doing is a labor of love. They're looking at the histories and various these other lived experiences and how that might inform how we think about our sense of calling and identity as a corporate Christian communities, right? Now, this is going to take time, but it needs to be done. And I think it's something that only one local church cannot work on by itself. For that matter, one denomination cannot work on by itself. And for that matter, one seminary cannot work on by themselves. Because what it involves is a sharing of our collective lived experiences, our social location and so forth, and how that might inform this grand narrative about who God is and how God has sent his son to redeem us, and what might be that calling that God is giving us. Now we are redeemed people, right? All those things needs to be carefully worked on. I really hope that whatever is emerging from Asian American side is very much rooted in our church experiences and not detached from it. Otherwise, we have this academic writings that have very little to do with church life, but rooted in the church for the sake of serving the church. And so we really need to work together, the theologians and pastors and other Christian leaders, as we do these things corporately.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Great question. Thanks, Mark. Okay, let me just further concisely state really how this time is going to go. After Charlene has given her plenary, we're going to also have JP come up and give a response, a pastoral response, as well as open it up for some Q&A. Just an introduction to Charlene's talk in particular. It is a talk that's actually focused on the intersection of faith formation and identity formation, Christian formation, and Asian American identity. And the name of the talk is called Inheriting Wisdom. What's the last piece? And Becoming a Prophetic Community. Would you join me in welcoming Dr. Charlene Jin Lee?
Thank you. Thank you for your welcome. It's a privilege for me to partake in these conversations with you and also to participate in the celebration of the Asian American Ministry Program begun here at Seattle Pacific University. I left my mother country of Korea when I was 6 years old. My last day of school in Seoul was a cold but bright January morning. My friends stood around me and my older sister with awe and envy, as little children do when somebody is munching away on a bag of chips they want in on. They circled us and looked at us as if now we were somehow different. I liked this kind of attention until they asked me to say something in English. For of course, we, leaving Korea, must know this foreign language. I only knew the ABC. No, not the ABCs, as in D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, and so on. I only knew the first 3 letters. My studious and smart sister rescues me and begins blurting out words, all the English words she ever learned, although I do not know when and where she learned them. And while the others leaned in silent amazement toward the sound of my sister's vocabulary list, my mind quietly grabbed onto one of her words, apple. Some speak of immigrating to a new country with $50 in their pockets. I left my motherland with the assurance of one English word in a little pocket of my own, apple, and 3 letters, A, B, C. At 6 years old, my capacity for engaging the world of a new culture and people was limited to one word. I would soon acquire new words and expressions, just as I would acquire a new way of seeing the world, of being in the world with others. Language, and many of you here are more than monolingual speakers, so you know that language is an entree to experience. It is the content and medium by which we interact with the world. This intrinsic relationship, this phenomena between language and culture, may be why theological seminaries require students to learn the ancient biblical languages, Hebrew and Greek, with the occasional exception, some of you in this room perhaps, are the 2 courses in an MDiv curriculum that seminarians dread. Drawing closer to the language and its text, however, ushers the reader into the world, the context, the culture, the meanings of the text. Language has this power to describe reality, at least to illuminate it. Language is more than a functional communication tool. It is like windows that supply glimpses and views of complex history, the particularity of a culture, the nuances of a people, their rituals and beliefs, their imaginations and interpretations. There is indeed a well of wisdom and understanding accessible to students of biblical languages. And with this access, they can immerse deeper in the particular history of the people of Israel, the stories of their experiences and connections with God. While students at San Francisco Theological Seminary, where I serve, grumble through their biblical language courses, they are introduced to yet another ancient language and its correlating culture when they enter my classroom. Students in a course I teach on theology and culture are given the opportunity to study the ancient Chinese characters, their more modern Korean iterations, and their meanings. I have found the rich resource of this poetic wisdom language of my forgotten heritage converge with and enlarge the contemporary theological discussion. I call it poetic wisdom language because it provides universal and particular descriptions of the human experience. The simplicity of one character or a small set of characters is able to describe truths and observations of ourselves and of the world. My pocket that once held a word and soon filled with a sophistication of language acquired from my adopted culture, that pocket had in my adult years grown deep and wide as I relearned my first language and inherited the garden of wisdom from my mother tongue of Hangul and well from my more antiquated grandmother tongue of Hanja. Studying this language has provided me access to a much deeper and extensive appreciation of who I am, from where I come, and offers me wisdom for my way forward. Through the study of this language, I've become intimately curious about the ethos, philosophy, culture, and history of my heritage and how it is intertwined in my present identity as an Asian American woman who professes faith in God through Jesus Christ. So I want to share a gift from this garden with you today, and perhaps fill your pocket with a new word from which you can expand the source of your own meaning making. I'm going to read it in Korean. 온고 지신. Some of you may read it in Mandarin or Cantonese. 온고 지신. The meaning of the first character relates to the root word warmth. The second root word relates to old. The third, knowledge. And the fourth character you see there, new. Warmth, old, knowledge, new. Warm up to the old for the knowledge of the new. One ought to understand history in order to envision the future. A Chinese-Canadian theologian said it most lucidly through her essay titled, I remember, therefore I am. I remember, therefore I am. The dynamic relationship between history and future is interlinked, is linked by the present. The present moment does not stand on its own. It does not breathe its own breath. It borrows breath from the previous moment and adds breath and gives life to the next. This continuity and change are at play in the present moment. So on this way we are on this way of attempting to describe and make sense of the present Asian American church, on this way of constructing and imagining the future, we need to recognize the quality and content of the breaths that compose our collective growing voice. We are people in rapidly changing times. Every industry, is interested in the idea of change, keeping ahead of change. Those of you who work in technology or business sectors know this especially well. A friend who designs video games suggested to me a book on this subject last week. The title says it all. Change happened yesterday. Leading in a culture of change is a skillful art that entrepreneurs, business managers, and ministers alike seek after. We are a generation that embraces change. And change is often perceived as a sign of youth. It signals creativity, new ideas. It may be a symptom of postmodernity, perhaps. This constant roll with change, however, can overwhelm the balance of continuity and change necessary for a community's ongoing relevant existence. A community that is relevant to its contemporary context while continuing to remain connected to something greater in time and space than the present moment. A community in all its longing for relevance and influence on the changing contemporary world may lose sight of its roots, forget its original story, and bypass the breath from which it draws to compose the present breath. Learning the past things requires a slower pace, a much slower pace than what the hurried planning for the future often affords us. We are indeed a generation less interested in history. We are more interested in the future. Wisdom teaches us, however, that the future is inextricably linked to the present and to the past. Education can temper this dynamic movement between sustaining tradition and of implementing new ways in which tradition is reinterpreted and lived out. And in the midst of these movements, identity is grounded in a particular tradition, even as it evolves towards new edges. Without tradition, our identity floats and rolls aimlessly through circumstantial and experiential changes. Conversely, without change, identity is suffocated by rigidity of loyalty to what has been, what has always been, as dictated by tradition. Authentic identity of a community is formed when both continuity and change are occurring, when tradition and new experience are equally valued. The Asian American church needs to recognize her history. Beyond the immigration history, we need to examine the ground on which we stand now, to study the topography of the ground as well as to mine its soil, to appreciate the textures of struggle and triumph that make up the particular history of people of God of the East, whom God encountered for thousands and thousands of years, and then again in another particular way when the first Western missionaries of the Christian church landed on their shores. The prevalent or popular history or historical narrative tells the story of Christianity entering Asia around the late 1700s with the introduction of Catholicism. Then a century later, in the late 1800s, with the arrival of Protestant missionaries of the modern age. There are indeed documents and artifacts that trace the presence of Christian religion in Asia many hundreds of years before that. Nevertheless, the problem with citing a time period as the start of Christianity in Asian cultures is that it presumes a moment devoid of the previous moment. It presumes introduction of a new religious system, a new worldview, a new set of doctrines that lodged itself onto a people and a geographic location where, particularly in the Korean peninsula, the factors of appeal and reception matched ever so perfectly to set the stage for a boom of the religion that Western missionaries passionately imported. The evangelical movement, especially throughout the 70s and 80s in South Korea, has achieved historic records. While there are variations of this history played out in different Asian countries, the Asian North American church shares the common birth narrative of the Protestant church in the continent of Asia, the meeting between Christianity and the people of Asian descent. As a professing follower of Jesus Christ, who is of Asian descent, I am compelled to interrogate this narrative because for most of my formative life as a Christian, the Asian part of me was not folded into the formula, a formula of Christian formation that I received. That is to say, while centuries and centuries old people and culture encountered an expression of God's church through European and American missionaries, I cannot readily detect parts of my Asian American Christian identity that is distinctly Asian. So where did the centuries and centuries worth of history, value systems, religious imaginations go? Where did the ethos of my Asian foreparents, their theological questions, their ways of meaning-making go? Was it only through the introduction of Christianity by foreign missionaries that Asian people came into the view of God, or God in the view of Asian people? Was this the starting moment of my spiritual heritage as a professing Christian? I did not begin to ask these questions until much later in my growing personal identity. And I'm so curious about the deep roots of my identity that reach farther than what history books tell me was the beginning of Christian faith for Asian people. And what of that, if any, sustains as remnants in my present Asian American identity? My studying of the original language of my heritage and teaching it to others, and mining wisdom from its beautiful and complex structures is one way that I have begun to search for that lost or forgotten part of my Christian identity, that Asian part, the part that seems to have silenced when Christianity entered. The only evident Asian thing, or not so American thing, about my experience growing up in the ethnic Korean church in the United States is that I had Korean friends at church. After church service, we ate Korean beef broth and rice. The formal Christian education I received at church was brought to me by well-intending and well-meaning Sunday school teachers who painstakingly read in their limited English the printed words of a teacher's manual, printed by David C. Cook Curricular Materials coming out of Colorado Springs, Colorado. My friends and I dutifully filled in the correct answers to the fill-in-the-blank questions on the Sunday school worksheets and considered most of the content in the application section of these materials as not quite applicable, since the scenarios never quite fit our realities. But they were acceptable, considering that we didn't look like any of the kids in these glossy materials. Having graduated through these materials and these series of Bible studies and Sunday school materials, I really thought that Jesus must have looked like Michael W. Smith. I really wondered how Jesus would ever understand the loud cries of Korean mothers who would pray at early morning dawn services. I really wondered if Jesus could know my thoughts if I thought them in Korean. This may have been my first unknowing attempt at contextual theological inquiry, attempting to make sense of theology, literally God words or words about God, as a child. The years moved on. I learned from my youth pastor all about the Reformation with a capital R. I am Presbyterian. The 95 Theses of Martin Luther, the Presbyterian hero John Calvin. I memorized Tulip. Those of you that know what I'm talking about, the 5 points of Calvin's theology. I went through confirmation class, learning the church's confessions, most prominently the Westminster Catechism. I responsibly followed the rhythms of the liturgical seasons, learning the appropriate moods of solace during the season of Lent, the more jubilant feeling of Eastertide. I acted in countless Christmas nativity pageants, where at the end, one of the church elders, dressed up in an unconvincing Asian Santa Claus, would march down the aisle, belting out ho ho ho's, carrying a sack of presents for all the children. I went on to seminary, where I was busy studying theology prescribed by Augustine, Schleiermacher, Tillich, Barth, among similar others. The same theologians that shaped the theologies of the Western Church and the missionaries that traveled to the East. The same theologians that shaped the first generation of Asian ministers in North American seminaries. The same theologians that continue to fill up the seats around the table considered classical or normative or correct theology. In the midst of my taking notes so that I can write my papers on and about these theologians, deciphering their language, one that was foreign to me, what I learned, mostly without even knowing I was learning, was that the originators and keepers of theology are European men. The understanding of God and interpretations of the Bible I've received belonged first to these forefathers, these fathers of faith. On the grounds level, what the church was teaching me, mostly without even knowing it was teaching me, was that we were to quickly learn and adapt the rules and rituals of the church, its worship and theology, its confessions and history, just as it was transmitted to the Asian church by the European or Western contextualized expression of Christianity. The Asian church had indeed received an expression of Christianity, a faithful yet reified expression that had undergone generations and generations of negotiations between doctrine and culture, between tradition and experience, a mixing of Christianity with pagan religious elements from Hellenistic, Germanic, Celtic, and Syrian systems, among others. Western Christianity reflects the theocultural negotiations grappled and formed by the people of European and North American descent. The Asian church received this not as a template to follow, whereby the gospel would interact with a cultural, historical, religious, and experience particular to the Asian location. Instead, the Asian church received the theological articulations and religious practices particular to the Western location and Western tradition as orthodox, as pure and correct, as whole and precise understanding of God. It has long been the dominant view that assumes that there is not one theology with a capital T, but many other theologies, diverse theologies emerging from particularized, what many claim to call indigenous faith communities or ethnic communities. What I would contend is that all theology is contextual. Some Christian theologians and theological communities explicitly and fundamentally recognize the incorporation of their own contexts into their theologies. On the other hand, the location of privilege held by the dominant Western theological community has power to assume universality and orthodoxy of its contextual theology. Historical dynamics elevates this community as the norm community, its interpretations as accurate, and its practices as sacred. Yet theologies emerging from European and North American people and communities are indeed and have always been contextual. The Western Christian tradition represents one of the many ways to interpret the biblical story for one's own situation. And all people must find their own way of speaking about God and generate new symbols, concepts, and models that they find congenial for expressing their religious vision. I believe it is critical for us to examine how formation in the Asian American church affords space for this kind of constructive work and for the integration of our cultural identity in our faith experience, in our spirituality, and in our theological dispositions. Asian American Christians live in some ambiguity of practicing the Christian faith while living amid cultural dualities. We heard that this morning. Unless the church recognizes these dualities and commits to engaging and cultivating them, we, while participating in outward religious practice, remain silenced in our inward cultural beings. For immigrants in particular, the pressure and desire to assimilate into dominant society is great. As socialization to mainstream society requires one to downplay or put aside Asian parts of one's identity, it is natural to experience self-alienation and ultimately forget or shed the thoughts and values that were once intrinsic to one's identity or the heritage one has received. What is true of a person is true too of a people. Just as each person needs to discover his or her own identity, so each community needs to affirm its own cultural heritage. To this end, Asian American Church must work towards redress and recovery of her religio-cultural inheritance. The question is, does God have room for the Korean part of me, the Japanese part, the Filipino part, the Indian, the Chinese part of me? Does the Christian church have room for these parts that run the course of my being and my view of the world, whether I readily recognize it or not? Does the Asian American church herself have room for this? Does the Anglo congregation have room for the kimchi smells that perfume the kitchen they share with the next in Korean congregation? Does the Korean American church herself have room for these smells? The answer to these questions is, of course, yes, yes, and yes. There is a lot of room. Just as there has been a lot of room for the early church as it struggled to find the edges of boundaries and points of synthesis between Greek philosophies and the story of Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. The burgeoning Christianity in the early church and the developing theology of that time moved through continuity and change as the story of Christ was encountered by new generation in places and new contexts. In this ongoing movement of continuity and change, however, Christianity's convergence with European culture holds great significance, because this convergence is when Christianity took on a decidedly monolithic dress, when Jesus put on a decidedly white face, and when the church became decidedly a religion of rulers. The European church sought to find its cultural, social, and political self in a religion rooted in Judaic heritage. And the erasure of the Jewish origins of the person of Jesus Christ is evident in art and theology alike, as expression of the church emerging from European location superimposed its face, its cultural hermeneutics to make sense of the gospel. The result of these cultural negotiations is Christianity as most of us know it today, more precisely the contextual Western Christianity. I appreciate the words of one of my mentors, Greer-Ann Wenin-Ing. She contends this: what a travesty it is if Christian preaching ever suggests that salvation means saving a person from herself or himself. Jesus came not to destroy a person's identity, but to fulfill it. If our Asian foreparents were afforded room for their identity, worldview, their culture, their knowledge systems, and their inherent spirituality to interact with Christianity, I wonder what they would have envisaged. I wondered if, for example, they imagined such a scene when they heard the story of Christ's virgin birth. I wondered if, for example, if they imagined themselves in the crowd as Jesus was carrying the cross to Golgotha. I wonder what I would envisage of my own theology and faith were I to enter this dialogue. I know that when I first saw these art pieces, I felt they were odd. It was a strange meeting of two worlds that I know intimately well, but yet two worlds that don't seem to belong. It seemed like the wrong picture, the right one. The right picture is one of Rembrandt's depiction of the Nativity, is it not? Set on a quiet Christmas night with Mary and others looking onto a radiantly glowing baby Jesus. The right picture, in my mind, is of a distant time and place, a distant people following the crowds up a hill in Palestine. This picture, this one is too familiar, too indigenous, too cultural, or too Korean, I thought. But authentic faith formation might look something like this. Authentic faith formation is an invitation to whole persons, to all that persons are. It imagines a faith community that affirms the cultural integrity of its members. We all come to this faith with a history, with our idiosyncrasies, with our ideologies. We all come to the reading of the Bible in the same way. The Bible does not speak the same to different ones of us. Today, a passage from the Bible might say something to you that it will not say tomorrow. Not because the Bible changes, but because you change. I change. We understand the Bible and live into a faithful expression of its truth within and from the reality of our lives and our contemporary world. The growing theology that I embrace is also unapologetically contextual and idiosyncratic. It is contextual to my identity as a follower of Christ, as Korean, as North American, as woman, as a seeker of the inbreaking of God in the midst of humanity. My religious imagination of God's expansive and generously inclusive realm is shaped by my experience of God, my experience of the world, and it continues to inform my understanding of God's revelation in the world and in the Word. The complexities of all that I am and embody are always a part of my read of texts. I am in no way unique to this complexity, for each of you hold together multiple identities, selves, demands, expectations, languages, cultures, and roles. While the multiplicity of all that you are and all that our identities make up often causes tension, it is from that tension of complex or simple identity we seek to live out a faithful embodiment of the gospel of Christ. Faith, then, is not a static thing, something for you to reach out and grab and acquire. Faith is the journey of seeking to make sense of the sacred that chooses to engage the worldly things. Faith is an openness to being stirred into a radical reality where holy God chooses to encounter ordinary people in ways that our earthly minds and our earthly bodies can perceive. My earthly body and mind as an Asian American seeking to recover my cultural heritage perceives God in more expansive and authentic ways as I discover wisdom from the tradition of my ancestors. One critical and theological wisdom I have gained from my ancestral traditions is the concept of communality. That is the self-understanding that is linked to my relationship within a community. I am always a part of the larger community. There is an insidious ideology we affirm in our American society. It is the myth of self-possession. The idea that I belong to myself. We value this autonomy in our country and in our culture. The self-sufficiency. We live in a reality where individualism is prized and privacy is considered a priceless commodity. The radical reality that Jesus invites us to enter, however, is one of interdependency, not independence. A new reality that operates on an economy of community, not on an economy of scarcity. A reality of shalom where mutuality and deference are practiced. This wisdom of community embedded in the religio-cultural traditions of Asian societies provides a predisposition, a unique disposition for understanding the radical reality that Jesus preaches. This is the character of a person. Read in Korean, it is in. The character is formed to depict two leaning on one another. To understand is literally to stand under. It's similar to the African proverb that says that a person is a person through other persons. Here we see the language of a people describing a reality in which self-sufficiency is not a condition of personhood. Rather, the context of relationship within which a person stands is signified in its linguistic characterization. What a beautiful, what a transforming idea. My heightened awareness of the relational and communal dimensions of my faith and my vocation is indeed connected to this inherited wisdom that coursed through my knowing and being. There's an interesting and intriguing research done by psychologists out of University of Michigan. There are linguists and psychologists that put this research together, and they studied how mothers first speak to their infant babies, children. And they studied that mothers from Western cultures, namely the US, the UK, and Western European nations, that mothers begin to talk to their infants using predominantly nouns. What is this? It's a spoon. Do you know what this is? It's a ball. The first measure of language that children acquire are predominantly nouns. The focus is on objects. For their counterparts, mothers in this study from Eastern or Asian cultures, as they study their language of their children, their words are made up mostly of verbs. What are you doing? Are you eating? Are you playing with that ball? The activity of their focus in communication and teaching of words reflect the embedded relational nature of their being. The interest is in the child's relationship with her world. The difference is quite compelling as we think about how we are formed to experience our worlds, even through the introduction into our language. I want to show you a picture of a boy. He's in the middle of this picture, and I'll ask you a question. I want you to think of your reactive answer. Is he happy? You can say it out loud if you wish. Is he happy? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to show you a second picture of the same boy. And I'm going to ask you to speak out your reactive answer to my next question. Is he happy? You've answered the question with your pause, with your hesitation. I asked this in my seminary classroom. Mostly, there aren't many Asian students in most of my classrooms. The answer comes very quickly. Yes, of course he's happy. Easterners, Asians, those of us with some Asian heritage, tend to have a capacity for scanning the whole, the context. While most Westerners and the epistemology that informs Western thinking and experiencing of the world, they often don't even notice the background. They don't notice the background kids. Or they do notice that they were there, but didn't notice that their expressions had changed. Even if they do notice the difference in their expressions, the observation is inconsequential to their assessment of the center boy's happiness. Sure, he's still happy. Why not? He's smiling. In the study that was done here through University of Michigan, they had gone to different nations and showed these two pictures. And the divide of the response was quite starkly separated by their cultural locations. The Eastern or Asian counterparts are puzzled and hesitate to answer the question. Or some very forthrightly say, no, he's not happy. How could he be happy? When asked why not, they respond, because the others are not happy. How can he be happy? There is something so theological and biblical about this cultural response. It reminds me of Dr. King's words. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. You can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. The morals and virtues and cultural norms continuing through the history of societies, of Asian societies, supports one's capacity for ascertaining this radical hope of a peaceable kingdom where we look out for one another, that unnatural way of being, when the lion does not attack the lamb, and where children put their hand into the snake's mouth. The interconnectedness of the human community, that I am connected to you, and you to me, then my actions and my inactions impact the welfare of someone living in places I have never been. As globalization and technology brings to focus this reality, there is a vital need for people and leaders whose disposition recognizes values and guards the relationship that link ourselves with the other. The Asian roots of my being supply this disposition that can see and be concerned with those kids in the background. Of course, I'm not contending that the religious and cultural heritage of our Asian roots supply only good or helpful things for our theological formation. There is no pretension that my Asian heritage is deeply seeped in systems of patriarchal and patrilineal gender hierarchy, where such cultural ideologies of namjanyobi, literally male superior, woman inferior, instruct fixed ideals of women's roles and their rightful place in the public and private realms. And we pass this on in the continuity of our communal identities, whether or not we see this or teach it without even knowing it. I recall a Friday afternoon at church, preparing with my high school friends for the evening youth group Bible study. A deacon in the church hurriedly called me over near the kitchen and handed me a plastic bag of large apples. Guests were visiting the senior pastor. Please quickly peel these and bring them to the pastor's office. As he handed me this heavy bag, the weight of this request fell heavy on my 16-year-old back. What made the air even more thick in that moment was that I smiled with great confidence as I made a hasty move toward the counter of the church kitchen, looking as if I knew exactly what to do. I grew up in a family with a brother and 2 other sisters, and I had learned that no roles were assigned to us based on our gender appropriateness. What I'm trying to say is that I had never peeled fruits. Among many other things, I had not done around the kitchen. I had never peeled fruits. At that moment on that afternoon, staring fearfully at those large apples now rolling around the industrial-sized wooden cutting board, I was angry at my mother, who never taught me how to peel apples. I was frozen in that place. I could not disclose what I experienced as a shameful confession. I don't know how to do this. Was it my pride, or was it something else? Some other force I couldn't recognize then, that admitting my lack of expertise around the church kitchen and these industrial-sized knives would change other people's perception of me as a good, godly Christian girl or a good Korean girl. In my very limited 16-year-old mind, I decided that I will produce apples on a plate to serve to the pastor and his guests. I began to carve pieces of apples, each looking like the kind I've been served before in family friends' homes, a crescent moon shape. I even mimicked the center wedge to look like the wedge normally created when cutting out the core seeds of the apple. And thanks to the large initial size of these apples, and to some of my learning in a sculpture class I took for a semester in junior high, I produced a reasonable number of small apple pieces to plate nicely for the pastor's office. Why do I tell you this seemingly silly story of a young high school girl who was too shy to speak up? Because the story, while it is somewhat silly, is not about my shyness to speak. It is about the message I received and perceived in my experience of the church's life that compounded over time, a message that told me that I should be at home with these requests and that it would be assumed that I had skills for such tasks. After all, the ability to peel an apple at time in history determined the marital worth of a potential young bride. And after all, in the church, where the most of my formative years of my faith took place, men were the pastors, men were the preachers, men were the elders, men led the congregational prayers, men in dark suits and white gloves served communion. Women taught Sunday school, they made delicious lunch for the church, they washed those gigantic pots, they organized the women's ministry. I think food, and I think you'll agree with me, is an incredibly important part of community of faith, in fact. I think that ministry to children and young people are critical for sustaining the creating work of the church. I do think that life-giving friendships are formed among the koinonia of women. At the same time, I think preaching, teaching, guiding, decision-making, worship leading pastoring, praying, counseling, and the ministries of reconciliation of all people are called responsibilities of the church that should be faithfully engaged by all of God's children for whom God has uniquely provided gifts. Years beyond that afternoon in the church's kitchen, I should tell you that I was praised for returning to my roots, to the ethnic church, to the ethnic Korean church, in fact. I have stayed, for the most part, in the first-generation immigrant church. When I first entered ministry, I was determined to learn the story of my cultural faith heritage. I served on a staff of 30 pastors, of whom only 3 were women. Yes, I did wake up while it was still dark to make it to the cold morning early services. And yes, I did sit in very long staff meetings where the senior pastor spoke most of its duration. However, I gained from there the color of my spirituality and learned the faith language of Christ's body converged with the Korean culture, how imperfect, incomplete, and holy it may be. Yet there were parameters to the shape of set for the shape of my ministry. I could not envision fully becoming and growing within the confines of an overtly genderized Christian church culture. At staff gatherings, my seat was assigned with the pastor's wives and with the other 3 female pastors. And I have served in variations of these congregations and arrangements in other first-generation and second-generation congregations in the different regions of the United States that my life and learning pursuits had taken me. I was always only a partial version of me in these churches, but I was there. The church that is most home to me today is not the Korean church, not the Asian church. It is not the Asian American church. It is a church where my leadership gifts are not only affirmed, but is offered many opportunities to grow. It is a church where I am invited to preach and minister, no, not only to children or to the youth, but to the whole church. It's a church that not only where I receive communion, but I offer and serve and celebrate the Lord's table. It is a church where my gender is not used as a test of my qualification for partaking in the various forms of Christian ministry. I am more fully me in this church. I am more fully becoming a faithful one called to serve the church. Then there comes the Sunday when, after speaking in the morning worship, after preaching, I was standing at the door at the end of the church, shaking hands with the congregants as they left. A cousin of a congregation member visiting from Texas rushes over to shake my hand with her bright and hard electric pink acrylic nails digging into my small hands. She proudly says, "Wow, I think it's just wonderful that you've learned to speak English without an accent." Like so many of you, I live in this ambiguous and paradoxical place that in between, and that's what some call the liminal space, yearning to find a stable place, to be understood, to belong, yet always knowing that I will never quite belong fully. Yet I choose not to defer to a center that seeks to assign me my place, but to be constructively me, growing in and out of my awkwardness and gaining strength to my voice. Well, some, and you will have your own stories of contradictions and conflicts and tensions and incongruencies in yourself and your identity. But there is a common identity theme, I think, that we experience as Asian Americans or hybrid identities. It is the fact that we are people who do not possess the certainty of knowing where we are exactly going or where we exactly belong. In a way, we do not have one home. We are on the way, traversing from here to there, from this world to that, translating from one language to another, transposing this context to another. As my predecessor, David Ng, described it so prophetically, we are people on the way. This might be why I like airports. People are on the way at airports, to and from, going everywhere. Everyone is moving on their way to a destination where they can rest or stop moving. The airport is like this liminal place where there is a lot of movement, where there is possibilities, because no one really belongs there. No one owns that location. People are moving, unrooted. They are on their way. Back to language as we slowly come to a close here. Thank you for your attention. Christianity is not a noun. It is not an object, a religion, or set of knowledge waiting to be acquired, or set of promises of personal gain to be consumed. Christianity is more like a verb. It requires a subject to enact it. The early church called themselves the followers of the way. This is not Chinese, by the way. The way is equivalent to helaka in Hebrew. Helaka comes from the verb to walk, helek. The way. Followers of Jesus were referred as people of the way. Christians are people on the way without a permanent home, lacking security of belonging. Their identity is found in their journey of walking, following, sometimes in darkness, other times in brightness, toward the extravagant love of the Creator and towards the call to extravagant love of neighbor. Jesus says that foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. As Asian Americans, I think we know something about this lack of home that Jesus describes. I have 3 or 4 more minutes? I'll get to my end. 1 minute. Okay. I want to get to the prophetic part a little bit more explicitly. A new word comes not from stability. A new word, a prophetic word, comes from displacement. There must be a stirring of water in order for healing to come. What I mean is that when everything is still, when things are good, you do not want change, and you do not advocate for change. It is when the world presents a reality that creates complications and chaos for you that when you struggle, that is when you seek change and dream visions for a different reality. In other words, when the system is working for you and you benefit from the current system, you don't want things to change. In fact, you will do all you can to safeguard the current system. Agitation to a system comes from those who do not benefit from it. You've probably heard a lot about marginality and marginal location, particularly as it relates to Asian American experience and theology. The marginal space is an uncomfortable and often dark space where there is, for people that are used to self-possession and depend on maps to guide them, it's this strange place. And yet it's a place of hope. It's a place of possibilities. It's a place where new prophetic words can come. I wonder if we can embrace that marginal space. Not as a negative space as it's usually connoted, but a place where wild, creative, new word and new images can thrive. It's like that liminal place that Sang-Hyun Lee has recently named, a place in between, a place where you don't quite belong, a place where movement is required, where there is little control or self-protection, kind of like an airport. A place where there is thirst and struggle, like Israel in the desert. A place of dying and rebirth, like Jesus in the tomb. Nothing good or creative emerges from business as usual. This is why so much of the work of God is to get people into these liminal marginal spaces and to keep them there long enough so they can experience something essential. It is an uncomfortable space, yet it is the ultimate teachable space, maybe the only one. Few of us choose this path. Instead, God usually has to engineer the journey into this seemingly weak, helpless, marginal, liminal place. Most spiritual leaders try to live lives of chronic liminality in some sense. They know it is the only position that ensures ongoing wisdom, broader perspective, and ever deeper compassion. The Jewish prophets, St. Francis, Mother Teresa, John the Baptist, for example. I will close here with this thought. As Asian Americans, we live in this ambiguous space of possibilities. And as we draw from the well of wisdom from our cultural and spiritual inheritance, we might be surprised to find ourselves equipped to faithfully, generously, and compassionately lead and walk alongside others through homelessness and displacement. To be wise companions for a world seeking to make meaning of so much senselessness that harms our common lives. To be co-learners for a world asking questions of ultimate meaning, questions of eternal significance. To be comfortable in the holding together of tensions, to be okay in darkness because we have hope that we are indeed on the way. I close by leaving you with some words from T.S. Eliot. Words that you may have to stay with a little bit. Words that will, in the fashion of liminality, leave you with a puzzling befuddlement, leaving you to continue to search. But hopefully and prayerfully, words that will both agitate and exhilarate your ideas about your own identity and the possibilities of the prophetic identity to which I believe God is moving us. Sometimes the best map will not guide you. You can't see what's around the bend. Sometimes the road leads through dark places. Sometimes the darkness is your friend. In order to arrive at what you do not know, you must go by a way which is the way of ignorance. In order to possess what you do not possess, you must go by the way of dispossession. In order to arrive at what you are not now, you must go through the way in which you are not. May God, who continues to bring a new word, God who calls to us today saying, "Behold, see, I am doing a new thing." May God lead us to places we have not been or have imagined. May God embolden us, the church, to be used to spring juniper where thornbush grow, and grow myrtle instead of briars, so that we can indeed say, as prophets have said, "Look, see, here is a new thing." Thank you.
So in the interest of time, I'd like to just offer a very brief response to Charlene. First of all, thank you for that address. I think Charlene, we are in her debt for modeling in her personal sharing, her communal sharing, her reflection on what is particular and universal in her very ambitious and far-ranging discussion. And in doing so, she models for all of us what it means to think theologically. If you think about God, you are a theologian. And what Charlene does has pulled together resources from history and theology and language and culture to show us what that looks like in practice. And so I want to thank Charlene for modeling what it means to engage and to dispute with the dominant Western European intellectual and spiritual tradition. So there's a lot here for us to chew on and think about. And finally, I want to thank Charlene for reminding us that we are called to love God not just with our soul and our strength, but also our hearts and our minds.